Hello and welcome to the Gifted Ed podcast. I am your host, Meghan McCarthy. We are grateful for the opportunity to share this space with you today as we talk about the complexities of giftedness. Today we welcome Krista Genovese to discuss hyperlexia and dyslexia and how they present in the gifted literacy curriculum. Krista is a first grade teacher at Quest Academy. She's interested in understanding and providing the foundational literacy skills needed for all learners in a gifted environment.
For a student with dyslexia, the risks that they're willing to take in a classroom is going to be very different than if it's just you and them. That's why it really is important for those kids to get one-on-ones to show what they don't know so that they can get the help that they need.
She has a master's in teaching and interdisciplinary arts. She holds an early childhood education license with additional endorsements in elementary education, reading, and art. She's a certified Orton-Gillingham dyslexia practitioner. Welcome to the Gifted Ed podcast, Krista.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
We're so excited. So I would love to start our conversation today by talking through what hyperlexia and dyslexia are and how you see them in the classroom setting. I think most of our listeners have probably heard of dyslexia a lot more regularly than hyperlexia. So kind of just
Probably so.
Yeah.
It took me a while. I didn't hear that term hyperlexia until actually a lot of searching because when I first started working at Quest Academy, I came here as a junior kindergarten teacher.
Okay.
And I saw a lot of students who came into my classroom, came into the gifted school initially because they were early readers.
Yeah.
And they were just almost miraculously knew how to read and we talked to parents like, did you give them instruction? And they apparently didn't have instruction. They just somehow absorbed reading skills.
Okay.
And as a teacher in the junior kindergarten, I really wanted to figure out the best way to serve those students with a literacy curriculum. And I did a lot of independent research and, trying to figure out how these students come to be already reading, and then what's the best way? Like, do you just skip reading instruction, or where do I support them
Right.
from here? And that's when it wasn't until I was doing my training to become a dyslexia practitioner that I came across the term hyperlexia in one of my textbooks, and it was describing it as essentially the opposite of dyslexia. So both dyslexia and hyperlexia. It just means that your brain is structured so that it takes in phonological information and sound symbol connections differently than a typical learner.
Okay.
So a hyperlexia is more intensified, and in a dyslexia, they take in the information in a different way.
Okay.
So it becomes harder for a dyslexic person to process sound symbol connections with a typical literacy instruction because their brain isn't holding on to the connections with instruction that's usually verbal.
Okay.
And so hyperlexia, the child is essentially memorizing. I mean, they're looking at words, and the capacity for human beings to memorize is really just stunning. Especially
Gifted.
in the context of hyperlexia.
Yeah. And then
where they can memorize just volumes of words, doesn't mean that they understand the words, but they can look at the words and then it connects the verbal equivalent to it like in a split second.
Okay.
Sometimes it also shows up with spelling too. Like I have 2 students this year who were both really early readers. They weren't, it was never like said that they were had hyperlexia, but they have all the traits of that.
Sure.
And one of them, when I was talking to him, when he spells anything that I give him, but he says that he sees the word in his head.
Got it.
So it isn't a phonetic understanding. It's almost visual.
Yes.
It's
Okay.
like memorizing it.
Okay. So hyperlexia does not assume decoding skills are there or reading comprehension skills are there.
Correct. And so it's a lot of times, it's one of the traits that comes with autism, ASD.
Mhm.
Not all the time,
Sure.
but it is a common trait that you do see. So there's different types of hyperlexia. There's one, they have I'm not an expert in I'm trained in dyslexia.
Sure.
I'm used to seeing this as someone who saw it in the classroom and then tried to sort of self-teach myself how
Yeah.
to accommodate for these students. So you have students who they'll come in and they're already reading and they can read. It seems like decode, but I don't even know if I would really use that word because it really is sort of a visual memorization,
Okay.
and not phonetically breaking it down. But they don't have the comprehension skills, so they don't understand what it is that they're reading. But then you do have students who have both, who can read any of it and then also process it for its meaning
Okay.
and think about it. And then you can have one that is present with other disabilities, and those usually lack the comprehension skills as well.
Okay.
There's mild dyslexia, moderate, and severe.
Hmm.
And in my preschool classroom, that would be when I would start seeing signs if there, was a question, is there dyslexia going on? But you would typically start seeing signs for that in preschool
Okay.
when students are learning sound symbol connections. And if there's a struggle there and it seems to require a lot more repetition, than a typical learning student, then that could be a sign. Then you could do a screening because the earlier that you catch dyslexia
Yeah.
and you can support the student while they're learning their literacy skills, the earlier you can do that, the better. Because once you get past or up to third grade and then you have a diagnosis, it becomes a little bit trickier because students go from, reading to learn to read to just reading to learn information. So you won't have the curriculum. So if someone gets diagnosed with dyslexia later, they'll need more additional support than they'd have in a classroom. Whereas if you catch it young, you could just have the teacher in the classroom support them in different ways with their foundational literacy skills.
So you talked about kind of some of the early signs for dyslexia. You mentioned the phonetic, or can you kind of talk through that again? What are the early signs? I mean, hyperlexia, I think you're just reading.
Hyperlexia is pretty, and you don't get a diagnosis
Yeah.
for it. Hyperlexia is sort of just a trait,
Yep.
and it's pretty obvious to spot,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Like they're reading.
Yep.
And dyslexia, they sort of like hearing information and then assigning it to some kind of a symbol
Got it. Okay.
is really difficult. And also sequencing or direction following, knowing like right from left,
Hmm.
doing reversals. A lot of people think that's the most common thing, oh, they're
You hear
writing
that.
backwards.
Yeah.
They have dyslexia. It's not always the case. It is really common, especially like BD reversals and Ps and ones that look common, look kind of similar. But it's almost like the graphical symbols don't have any orientation. It could be going in any direction and it's still a letter, but they're not really putting it in their mind associated with a sound in a particular orientation. So
Okay.
that's why a lot of times you see the writing, like I can see kids write, entire sentences backwards, and their brain is just seeing it that way.
Okay. So you really see it in the writing as that.
Writing and reading. If they're
Mhm.
having a lot of time, like vowel sounds in particular, just because they sound kinda similar,
Mhm.
the eh, uh. So if they're really struggling, that's just an early
Differentiating those.
sign.
Okay.
Right, it's kind of knowing even because, like, in 1st grade, I'll still see kids struggle with the vowel sounds, and then to keep an eye on that.
Yep.
So in the younger ages, you can get a screening,
Yep.
and then once they're, I'd say, like, kindergarten or 1st grade where the kids are really starting to read, and if the teacher or parents are seeing signs that the kids are resistant or they're just not remembering the letters in a after a typical repetition, then you can get an evaluation from like a neuropsych, or you can get an educational evaluation, which was not a medical evaluation, but they do accept. I know, like in public schools, they will accept an evaluation from a if they're trained to give the
Educational
dyslexia.
diagnosis.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, and then you kind of touched on this in terms of how can an educator support a child either with hyperlexia or dyslexia?
Right. So there's like two extremes. And
Yeah.
so when you're in a classroom, the more extremes that you have, then the more challenging it becomes for you to differentiate. But you, with reading in particular, it's so important to understand as the teacher where the student is and where you need to come in to give support um, with explicit information as well as emotional support. Because if you're in either end there, you're you're starting to learn to read, there's so many emotions that get attached to reading. Pressure that kids feel, pressure that their parents put on them, maybe not, not intentionally, but it's just there sometimes. Or if they're seeing other kids in the
Peers.
class who are
Yeah.
reading and they're not understanding why they're not getting it. So a typical reader, say you're just like learning letter sounds or phoneme sounds, it would take, I think it's like 4 or 5 repetitions or exposures to that sound symbol connection before they could then retain that information. A gifted learner might only take 1 time,
Okay.
but a dyslexic learner needs 20 times. So if you're teaching your classroom with like 4 or 5 exposures of a new concept, and then you're testing and then moving on, a gifted learner will learn it and then start getting bored after the second time.
Yep.
And then, the typical learners, will get what they need. But then anyone who needs more exposures after that, they're just going to kinda start to get it and then lose it.
Yep.
And then that's gonna just keep happening over and over again until all of a sudden they're in 3rd grade and they don't know how to read because they haven't had enough exposures to all of these phonetic concepts, for their brain to start puzzling it all together. The tutoring that I do or the Orton-Gillingham certification that I have,
Yeah.
that's called structured literacy, and there's a bunch of different programs that you can get certified in structured literacy. Orton-Gillingham started it. Orton and Gillingham is a teacher and a scientist,
Okay.
and they worked together to create the structured literacy program. It's multi-sensory and it's explicit. Those are the 2 important things. And for a classroom teacher, it can be difficult because those things both require a lot of time, and organization. So with multisensory, the idea is that when you're teaching a concept or a sound symbol connection, you want to simultaneously engage as many modalities as you can to strengthen the pathway in the child's brain to remember it.
Okay.
So you want to engage like verbal, visual, kinesthetic, as much as you can simultaneously and also repetitive.
Yeah.
Like you need enough exposures with that over and over so that they can eventually have it part of their knowledge base and they can use it to start building words together.
And I can see that being tricky if your
Yeah.
classroom, especially within gifted learners, trying that you can see the benefit of in need for outside support for someone with dyslexia to get the repetition in so that they have that as a rote muscle, it sounds like.
Right. They definitely need one-on-one support outside of school. I mean, once there is a diagnosis for dyslexia, you definitely want to have a one-to-one tutor to go through explicitly each part of the English language, and you don't move forward until there's proven mastery.
Okay.
And then you have to keep going back and reviewing. And then also, once they strengthen the basic foundational skills, then you start building up morphology education so that then they can work the word out from the parts of the word to put a meaning to it as well.
Okay.
So with hyperlexia, a lot of what I've seen is in classrooms is you'll get a student that comes in who's already learning to read and is excited and wants to just read advanced books. But if they've never learned phonetically how to break apart words, then there's a danger that once they get older and they get more complex texts, like in science and social studies that they haven't memorized and they haven't come across before,
Yeah.
but they don't have the phonetic skills to code it, what happens is the brain will just look at the first letter and the last letter, and then in a millisecond, fill in a different word
Okay.
that has, the same kind of look to it.
Yep.
And that might be okay, like once in a while. But if that's happening often because they don't have the phonetic skills, if you exchange a couple words in something that you're reading, it's going to totally change the meaning of what you're reading.
Yep.
And so there has been studies that have shown that comprehension skills in early readers can start to drop, like around middle school
Okay.
when they start getting like those more complex words.
Okay.
So so knowing that is important as a teacher in primary grades or early childhood grades, that even though the child is showing you they know how to read, they still need that explicit phonetic instruction
Yes.
so that they can not only just memorize words, but they can also decode them. And morphology is also going to be really good with those students as well. So I was saying earlier, sometimes I would get students with hyperlexia who were good spellers, but my experience in the classroom in junior kindergarten was that a lot of times kids who were early readers that came in were not good at spelling and writing and coding
Okay.
because it's really phonetic. Like you have to break the word down
Found it.
and then
Yep.
you have to assign a grapheme to each phoneme. And if you don't know those, then, that's a lot harder.
Yep.
So there would be an imbalance in the encoding and the decoding skills. And so for me, that was perfect because then I could teach phonics instruction with writing. But it was like a way as a classroom teacher to organize it so that you gave the instruction while they were writing and they could think about the words phonetically and then learn how to assign the graphemes to them.
Well, and when we were first talking about, I guess two things. When we were first talking about hyperlexia, I naively was like, well, I think eventually you age out of that label because you
You
need to
can.
commiserate with peers.
Right.
But now I'm realizing the phonetic
Mhm.
part to it, right? And the reading comprehension part to it, where if those
Right.
aren't worked on, it's not an
Mhm.
aging out kind of thing because those skills are there's such a discrepancy between, but
Mhm.
also the material you're getting is aging up too. So eventually
Right.
it's
Yeah,
up to
you're
you.
right. So the comprehension skills are really important.
Mhm.
And I found in my experience, I mean, this is just through observation. I don't know if this is the case or not. But the students that I've worked with that have dyslexia, typically, in my experience, have really high comprehension skills.
Yeah.
They're usually very creative. They think outside the box.
Yep.
Their brain thinks differently.
Yep.
Some of the, really famous, intelligent, impressive people in the world have
Absolutely.
had dyslexia,
Yeah.
and it makes them creative thinkers. And so I have found I have not had a lot of problems with comprehension with those students. Once in a while,
Okay.
you do. But someone with hyperlexia, it's a lot more common. And so those skills, comprehension skills, and then so in the gifted school, it's really important because a typical gifted student also has really high comprehension
Right.
skills. So if someone's coming in with hyperlexia, you want to give as much support, for them to use their thinking voice while they're reading.
Yeah.
So a lot of times they're so used to their reading voice that's just reading the words,
Mhm.
but not thinking about what it is that they're reading. So in the first grade classroom, I do, reading groups. And so with my high group, I spend the majority of the time on comprehension skills and constantly thinking about what you're reading and reading to understand. So I talk about this all the time in class. We read to understand. And if you don't understand what you're reading, it is a total waste of your time. Like,
Yes. Yep.
no point to it at all. So if you don't understand what we just read, it's their responsibility to stop and reread it, or we need to and work on vocabulary. Vocabulary words are so important for all of these readers, and just constantly getting them to think about it. And some of the high readers that I have a hard time with that because they're
Okay.
just not focusing on the meaning while they're reading it. They're just
Yes.
reading the words. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it just kind of highlights again, anytime we do a deep dive into any part of this, that there's so many different muscles, right, that go into the reading and the
Oh,
writing.
yeah. It's a
And some
lot.
are innately going to be stronger than others in the compensation skills that our brains
Mhm.
come up with to manage and to get through the day and keep up with peers, right? Manage the pressures that we just talked about. Because reading is a big deal.
It
If all
is.
your friends are pulling out books and talking about and
Mhm.
sharing books, it's a huge peer relation engagement that you can participate in.
For a student with dyslexia, the risks that they're willing to take and their vulnerability that they're willing to show in a classroom is gonna be very different than if it's just you and them.
Yeah.
It's why it really is important for those kids to get one-on-one so they can at least feel comfortable to show what they don't know so that they can get the help that they need. Yeah, it's important. And then, differentiation is hard, you know? I mean, in
Mhm.
a gifted school, any classroom, you have to work on that. I feel like in a gifted school, especially, and it's difficult to manage, like, just classroom management wise.
Yeah.
So it's as teachers, I feel like it's really worthwhile to put a lot of thought into how to divide up your class and manage the instruction so that it's catering to the needs that the kids in your class have.
So I guess what are some approaches that have been helpful, or what is it breaking up? I guess the kids that they have the reading skills, but not, yeah.
Mhm.
What are
Well, I mean, reading groups is probably the easiest. I mean,
easiest?
people most
Yeah.
teachers are able to do that. Um, and then you can change the text that you use and then the expectations that you have. And for writing as well. For phonics instruction, I've found that if I give whole group instruction for a concept, I can have them all engaged because it's kind of like parts to a puzzle. So even the kids who are already reading are interested in learning like all of the phonetic details that go into making up
Okay.
words. But then when I do application of that concept and then testing, I have to break my class up into groups and have that more directed towards the
Skill.
skill set.
Okay.
So it's a lot of, like, figuring out what kind of work can your class do
And yeah.
independently, and then toggling back and forth, and a lot of preparation to have
Sure.
everything ready.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, and then another piece to the puzzle is the caregivers, right? So at home,
Mhm,
we talked about, obviously, with dyslexia, having outside tutoring being a huge piece to
mhm.
working on this. What are some other pieces that you found effective?
I would say the best thing that you can do at home is to have the just right books, like the most appropriate books for your child, because since they're probably gonna be asked to read every
Yep.
night, and if the books are too easy or they're too hard, they're gonna get frustrated and probably resist. Or sometimes parents I mean, because, most people don't have a education in literacy, and so you just buy
Yeah.
books and it's kinda hard, and books can be kind of expensive too. So or if you go to the library, you don't know which books to look for. And when kids are just starting to learn how to read, you really need to have books that are decodable and at their level.
Yeah.
So I mean, the best thing you can do is ask the teacher because the teacher's gonna know best which books are appropriate for them at that moment. And there's a lot of things that they can just print. We use UFly here at Quest Academy, which is at University of Florida, and they have free phonics program
Okay.
that's available on the internet to anybody, and they have printable reading passages that are sequenced that take all of the literacy skills that students learn sequentially and that build upon each other, and you can print for free. It's amazing, honestly, and they're really high quality. The reading passages, so and use that in lieu of a book
Okay.
too. So, as far as if you wanna get something for someone who's just starting to read and then the books at home are not appropriate.
And then and being a social worker and how I work with students, it's also fascinating with the gifted profile, because just because they can read a text doesn't mean they are emotionally ready to read certain books
Yeah,
too, right? Dyslexia,
exactly.
hyperlexia,
I know.
whatever. That's another piece too. So I feel like relying on teachers and librarians just to kind of have that. What are some books that are accessible to my kid where my kid can emotionally digest what's
Mm-hmm.
happening too? Because that's a whole
Yeah.
other piece to this too, right?
There is. There are right now, my class is really into Newsella, which is an online news for kids,
Cool.
and you can
Okay.
adjust the lexile level and the word count with just like a drop down list, and it's the same. Because the class I have this year, they really like nonfiction, and so that group has been real. My high readers have loved Newsella, so it's all like they're interested in what's going on in the
Yep.
world, and they want to talk about it, but it's not appropriate for them to be reading a
Right.
newspaper. Um, so or watching even the news on TV. So Newsella is great because it's like a new article every day. And you can print it, and then there's comprehension quizzes that come with it too,
Okay.
and they're really interesting. My kids gobble them
Yeah.
up. It's challenging for them to read, but also it's like safe.
It's, yeah. And some of those are just like those huge reading series that are meant maybe for seventh or eighth graders, but for second
Mhm.
graders,
They
be able
wanna
to read
read
that,
it
right.
right.
But
Yeah,
then you're
and they're
having
not like boyfriends and
correct.
girlfriends, and
Yeah.
I know. On the other end, for dyslexic students who are a little older, there are these books called high-low
Okay.
books that are, low decodable,
Yeah.
but they're high
Interest. Yep.
interest, not baby books, because, you don't want them reading books about little
Right.
ducklings. They're gonna be embarrassed by it. So, at the Dyslexia Center, they have a wonderful library there, with the high-low books where they're interesting for older kids that are not embarrassed to be
Yep.
reading it, but they're able to decode the words and get meaning out of it. So those books are kind of expensive and hard to find. Those are kind of books you would probably have to
Okay.
order. Some libraries might have
But just
them.
knowing their options, right? Like that's always
Mhm.
the biggest piece. Um, well, thank you so much, Krista, for sharing your expertise and your time with us today. We're so grateful for your insight and for this conversation.
Thank you. It's been great. I love talking about reading.
It's fun. So before we end, just some reflection questions. Thinking of the students in your classroom, are there any students whose reading abilities stand out to you? And a follow up with a call to action is that we just talk through strategies to support students with either dyslexia or hyperlexia. And can you select one support that we discussed and implement it with one of your students this week? We want to thank you for joining us in this space today. Please subscribe to the Gifted Ed podcast to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Stay tuned for our next episode that continues to unpack the complexities of giftedness.